Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about some fascinating research from a scientist named Xiao Zhang and his work with perovskites.
Yeah, his work is really pushing the boundaries of what we can do with perovskites.
Now, perovskites themselves, I think, are pretty cool. They're these materials that can convert sunlight into electricity.
Right, like in solar cells.
Exactly, like in solar cells. And we've got some sources here talking about how they're structured. And they're talking about 3D perovskites, 2D perovskites, quasi-2D perovskites. Where should we even begin with all this?
Well, I think a good place to start is with the basic structure of a 3D perovskite. So imagine you have like a box, right? And you want to fill it with as many marbles as possible. You could just toss them in randomly, but they wouldn't fit very efficiently.
Right.
Perovskites are similar. They have a very specific crystal structure that's kind of like that box. And the atoms that make up the perovskite are like the marbles fitting together in a very precise way. So in a 3D perovskite, you have these layers of atoms all packed together tightly in a repeating pattern.
Okay, so that's 3D. How do we get to 2D then? Would we just like flatten the box or something?
That's actually a great way to think about it. In a 2D perovskite, you insert larger molecules between those tightly packed layers. These molecules act like spacers, forcing the layers apart and essentially creating sheets of perovskite material.
So we've got a stack of perovskite sheets with these molecular spacers holding them apart. But why go to the trouble of making them 2D? Doesn't that make the structure weaker?
Well, it's kind of the opposite, actually. While 3D perovskites are really efficient at converting sunlight to electricity, they're also a bit fragile. Think of it like a stack of perfectly aligned playing cards.
Okay.
It's stable as long as you keep it perfectly still, but any disruption can cause it to collapse. 2D perovskites, on the other hand, are much more robust.
It's like we're adding support beams to that stack of cards, making the whole structure more resistant to things like heat, moisture, or even light.
Exactly. And that's a huge advantage when you're talking about real-world applications for solar cells.
Yeah.
You need them to be able to withstand the elements.
Right, because solar cells are going to be outside.
Exactly.
They're going to be exposed to all sorts of things. So it sounds like 2D perovskites might be the key to making these solar cells more durable and therefore more practical for widespread use. Now, this is where Xiao Zhang's work comes in, right? He was specifically focusing on these 2D perovskites and how to make them even better.
That's right. His PhD research was all about fine-tuning these 2D perovskites to enhance both their stability and their efficiency.
Okay, so we've got this really promising material, 2D perovskites. What were some of the key challenges that Xiao Zhang was trying to solve in his research?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is controlling the orientation of the crystals. You want those perovskite layers to be standing upright, perpendicular to the substrate.
Okay, to create efficient pathways for charge transport, right? Like building a bridge, you want those support beams to be vertical to hold the weight.
Exactly. If those layers are lying flat, it's much harder for the charges to move efficiently through the material.
Makes perfect sense. So Zhao was working on getting those perovskite layers to stand up straight. What else? What were some of the other things he was focusing on?
Another key factor is the distribution of different phases within the 2D perovskite film. Remember how we talked about those spacers creating layers? Well, you can have different numbers of perovskite layers between those spacers. And the number of layers, we call that the N value.
Right, the N value, the number of layers in each stack. And I think I remember you mentioning that a higher N value means you're getting closer to the efficiency of 3D perovskites, right?
Precisely. But the trade-off is that those phases with the higher N values, they are also less stable. They're more susceptible to degradation.
Ah, so it's like a balancing act. You want the efficiency of those higher N phases, but you also need the stability of the lower N phases.
Exactly. And that was one of the main challenges that Xiao was trying to address. How do you control where those different phases end up within the film? Could he arrange them in a way that maximized both efficiency and stability?
Sounds like a tricky puzzle to solve. Now, we're also seeing here in our notes something about quasi-2D perovskites. And then it starts to list all these different types, like Ruddleston-Popper, Dion-Jacobson, and alternating cation in the interlayer. What are all these different types, and did Zhao work with all of them?
Those are all different ways to categorize 2D perovskites based on the specific spacers used and how they arrange those perovskite layers. You can think of them as different architectural styles for our perovskite building.
Different approaches to creating that layered structure.
Okay, right. And in his research, Xiao chose to focus on a specific type called Dion-Jacobson perovskites.
Dion-Jacobson.
And he used a really interesting spacer molecule called PDMA.
PDMA, all right. So why did he choose to work with Dion-Jacobson perovskites And this PDMA spacer, what was so special about them?
Well, PDMA is known for its rigidity. It creates strong bonds between the perovskite layers, which helps to hold the structure together and make it more stable.
So he's chosen his building material carefully. It's like using super strong glue to hold those layers in place.
Exactly, and that strong bonding helps to prevent those perovskite layers from shifting or degrading over time.
Okay, so that's the spacer. But it sounds like he wasn't content with just using a strong spacer. He wanted to really fine-tune the recipe right. Our notes mention that he manipulated the cations within the perovskite structure too.
You're absolutely right. He didn't stop there. Remember how we talked about those marbles fitting into the box? Well, those marbles represent different types of ions or charged atoms.
Okay.
Specifically, he played around with different combinations of organic cations, like methylammonium or Ma and formamidinium or Fa.
So it's not just about the spacers between the layers. He's also adjusting the composition of those perovskite layers themselves. I'm starting to understand just how complex this research gets.
You're catching on quickly. And that's just the beginning. Xiao's real innovation lies in the specific processing methods he used to manipulate those 2D perovskite structures.
That's where things get really interesting.
It definitely is.
All right, well, I'm ready to dive into the details of his work. Let's get into those processing methods and hear how he manipulated these perovskites to achieve both stability and efficiency. Okay, so we've got our perovskite building blocks, the sturdy PDMA spacers, and a mix of those Ma and Fa cations within the layers themselves. Now, how did Xiao actually put all of this together? I'm guessing it's not as simple as just mixing everything in a bowl and hoping for the best.
You're absolutely right about that. Creating high-quality 2D perovskite films for solar cells requires really precise control over the crystallization process. You're essentially manipulating those tiny crystals, getting them to arrange themselves in just the right way.
So it's like molecular level architecture.
Precisely.
What were some of the techniques that Xiao used to control this process?
One technique that he used is called hot casting. So imagine you're making a thin film of perovskite using a process called spin coating. It's kind of like spreading batter on a spinning pan to make a crepe.
Okay, I can picture that.
Okay.
So where does the hot part come in?
With hot casting, you heat the substrate, the surface you're coating, before you deposit the perovskite solution.
Right.
And this helps to control the evaporation of the solvent, and it encourages the perovskite crystals to orient themselves vertically.
So it's like baking those perovskite layers upright.
That's a great analogy.
Why is that vertical orientation so important?
It's all about creating efficient pathways for charge transport. So you want those charges to move easily through the perovskite film, and having those layers stacked vertically, perpendicular to the substrate, helps to facilitate that movement.
It's like building a highway straight through the material.
Exactly.
Did Xiao try any other techniques to control the crystallization process?
He did. Another one he explored is the anti-solvent technique.
Okay.
And this is kind of like adding a dash of cold water to hot caramel to get it to set quickly.
Okay.
In this case, you drip a solvent that doesn't mix well with the perovskite solution onto the film while it's still spinning.
So you're basically disrupting the perovskite solution while it's trying to dry.
Right.
What kind of effect does that have?
This sudden introduction of the anti-solvent, it forces the perovskite to crystallize much more rapidly, and that can help to create smoother, more uniform films, with fewer defects.
So it's like a controlled shock to the system.
Yeah.
Forcing those perovskite crystals to snap into place.
That's a good way to put it.
Pretty cool. And, it sounds like controlling this crystallization process is just so crucial for getting those high-quality perovskite films that you need for these solar cells to actually work efficiently.
It really is.
And speaking of fine-tuning, Xiao also explored something called additive doping. It's like adding a pinch of spice to your recipe to enhance the flavor. What exactly does that involve?
So additive doping is essentially adding a small amount of a specific chemical to that perovskite solution.
Right.
And this can actually affect the crystal growth in a variety of ways.
Okay.
Some additives promote larger grain sizes, others improve the overall crystallinity of the film.
So it's like giving those perovskite crystals a little nudge in the right direction, encouraging them to grow in a certain way. Did Xiao look at different types of doping?
Yeah, he investigated both excess doping, where you basically add more of a certain component, and substitutional doping, where you actually replace a part of the original material with the additive.
Wow, so he was really controlling every aspect of this process. But I think the most exciting part of his research is this spacer mixing technique that you mentioned earlier.
I think you're right. That was a key innovation.
So can you remind us again, he was already using that rigid PDMA spacer.
Right.
But he found that by adding a small amount of another spacer called PA,
Yep.
he could dramatically enhance the film's properties. What was so special about this combination? What did the PA bring to the table?
Well, you see, he was trying to address this challenge called missing bridging. Sometimes those spacer molecules don't perfectly connect those inorganic perovskite layers.
Yeah.
So you kind of have these gaps in the structure. And by adding PA, it helps to fill in those gaps, creating a more continuous and robust network.
So it's like reinforcing the connections between those perovskite layers, making the whole structure that much more stable.
Exactly.
Did this have a noticeable impact on the final perovskite film?
It really did. The results were remarkable. By carefully adjusting the ratio of PDMA to PA, Xiao was actually able to achieve something called a reversed gradient phase distribution.
Reverse gradient. Okay, what exactly does that mean?
So remember how we talked about those different phases with varying N values?
Those different numbers of layers.
Right. Well, typically the phases with higher N values, the ones that are more efficient but less stable, they tend to congregate at the bottom of the film.
So they're like settling out during the drawing process.
Exactly.
So you end up with the most efficient but least stable parts of the film exposed to the elements.
Yeah, not ideal. But with spacer mixing, Xiao was able to flip this arrangement. He created a film where the more stable phases, those with lower N values, were concentrated at the top, acting as a protective layer for the more efficient phases underneath.
That's brilliant.
It is, right.
It's like he gave the perovskite film this built-in shield against degradation. Did his research actually show how much of a difference this made in terms of stability?
His findings definitely suggest that spacer mixing and this reversed gradient phase distribution, it really can significantly enhance the long-term stability of these 2D perovskite solar cells.
This is really impressive. It sounds like he cracked the code for making these perovskites both efficient and durable.
He was certainly on the right track.
Okay, so we've covered hot casting, anti-solvent techniques, additive doping, and now this spacer mixing. It's clear that he had such a deep understanding of how to manipulate these 2D perovskites at a molecular level.
He did.
But did his research stop there? Our notes mentioned something about pattern films and imprinting lithography.
He didn't stop there. He also explored ways to enhance the performance of these solar cells even further by creating these patterned perovskite films. So think of it like, adding texture to a surface to change how it interacts with light.
Intriguing. Before we get into the specifics, can you explain why patterning is important for solar cells in the first place?
Sure. So it's all about maximizing light absorption and creating more efficient pathways for charge transport. So by strategically creating these patterns on the perovskite film, you can essentially engineer the material to interact with light in a more beneficial way.
Okay, so you're essentially trying to fine-tune how the perovskite film captures and uses that sunlight.
Exactly.
So how did Xiao go about creating these patterns? What did imprinting lithography involve?
So he used this technique called imprinting lithography. It's basically like using a tiny stamp to create a pattern on the surface of the perovskite film.
Okay.
He used a stamp made of a flexible material called PDMS.
I'm picturing like a miniature printing press for perovskites.
That's a great way to think about it.
That sounds incredibly precise.
It is incredibly precise, and that's where he ran into some challenges.
Okay.
Reproducibility was an issue. It can be really tricky to get those patterns to form consistently, especially at such a small scale.
Yeah, I can imagine. Working at the nanoscale is never easy.
Exactly.
But it sounds like he was onto something promising.
Yeah.
Did he explore any other approaches to patterning these films?
He did. He started thinking about this more bottom-up approach.
Yep.
Instead of directly patterning the perovskite film itself, what if you patterned the underlying layer, the substrate on which the perovskite is deposited?
Ah, so you're creating a textured foundation to guide the perovskite growth.
Right.
Interesting. What's the advantage of that?
Well, it could be a more practical approach for large-scale manufacturing. Instead of that really delicate top-down imprinting, you're influencing the perovskite structure from the ground up.
Okay, so that's potentially a more scalable way to create those patterns.
Yeah.
It sounds like we've covered a lot of ground today, from the basic structure of perovskites to these really, innovative processing techniques that Xiao was exploring, even his work with patterned films. It's clear that he made some really significant contributions to the field of perovskite solar cell research. What were some of his key findings, and their overall impact? It really does seem like Xiao's work opens up a lot of possibilities for perovskite solar cells.
Yeah.
His approach to manipulating their structure is it's so fascinating, and it seems so promising.
Yeah, it really is. It kind of gives us this blueprint for designing perovskite solar cells that are not only efficient, but also really durable, which, is what we need if we're going to be using them in the real world.
Right, exactly, because solar cells are going to be exposed to all sorts of, harsh conditions like heat, moisture, and even light, which can cause them to degrade over time. So having that stability is absolutely crucial.
It is. And it's not just about solar cells either.
Okay.
2D perovskites are so versatile. They've got potential for all sorts of applications.
Like what? What else could we use them for?
Well, researchers are already looking into using them for things like LEDs, sensors, even next generation electronics.
Wow, that's incredible. It sounds like we've only just scratched the surface of what these materials can do. So to kind of wrap things up, what would you say are the biggest takeaways from Xiao Zhang's research? What should our listeners really remember?
Well, I think the key message is that 2D perovskites have incredible potential. They could really revolutionize how we generate and use energy, and not just with solar cells. And Xiao Zhang's research is just one example of the amazing work that's being done to harness that potential and turn it into a reality.
Yeah, and I think it's really inspiring to see someone, so meticulously working on this problem, trying to find solutions that are both innovative and practical.
Right. And his dedication has definitely paid off. His findings are going to have a lasting impact on the field. It's going to help other researchers develop even better perovskite-based technologies in the future.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into the world of 2D perovskites and the remarkable research of Xiao Zhang. It's been a fascinating journey exploring these incredible materials and their potential to transform our world.
I completely agree. It was a pleasure discussing this with you.
And as always, thank you to our listeners for joining us on this deep dive. Keep those brains curious, and we'll see you next time for another exploration of the latest scientific discoveries.